Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you all to this evening's event, Reclaiming the Commons, the Value of Public Space. My name is Shelley Repp. I am chair of the Committee of 100 on the Federal City. The committee was founded 100 years ago to sustain and safeguard the fundamental values of the L'Enfant and Macmillan plans that give the nation's capital much of its distinction, beauty, and rich community character. DC's public spaces play a part in enhancing our city. 2023 is our centennial year. We're marking this milestone by holding a series of what we call conversations, focusing on some of our city's challenges. The speakers for this evening will be Susan Piedmont-Palladino, Director of the Washington Alexandria Architecture Center at Virginia Tech, Scott Kratz, Senior Vice President at Building Bridges Across the River, and Coy McKinney, teacher, community gardener, and advocate for public space. I'll introduce each before their formal presentation. We will reserve time for questions from the audience after all three speakers have spoken. To ask a question, please go to the center aisle and line up behind the microphone. Please keep your questions brief so that our speakers can engage in conversation with each other. Aiden Jones will moderate the question and answer period. Aiden has practiced law for 48 years in large and small firms, national and international. He first became involved pro bono with DC zoning and land use issues in the mid-70s with Friendship Neighborhood Coalition, and after a hiatus again in 2015. He became a member of the Committee of 100 in 2018, a trustee in 2020, and serves on our zoning and planning subcommittees. After the program, please join us for refreshments in the narthex and conversation. Refreshments and conversation in the narthex. Committee members are identified by badges, and we invite you to talk to any of us and learn more about our organization. We welcome new members. With that, can we bring our first speaker in by Zoom here? Thank you. Okay, our first speaker is Susan Piedmont-Palladino, an architect, professor, and director of Virginia Tech's Washington Alexandria Architecture Center, the urban extension of the College of Architecture, Arts, and Design. DC is a teaching laboratory for Professor Piedmont-Palladino and her students. The author of Green Community, Intelligent Cities, and Timber City, Susan's current research explores how American public spaces are shaped and reshaped by our shifting values of openness and security, changes we can see play out in the histories of public spaces in our city. Susan is joining us on Zoom from London, where she is leading a student group for the next 6 weeks. We appreciate her willingness to join us so late in the evening in London. Please welcome Susan.
Well, thank you all. I wish I were there with you because I wouldn't be in this strange liminal time space, but it's dark here in London, pretty dark, and you might see over my shoulder a view down the railroad tracks to Canary Wharf, which is kind of an interesting view to have on screen if you can see it. I'm really happy to be here, and one of the reasons I wanted to zoom in from London for this conversation is because this is such an important topic, and the chance to talk about it is irresistible to me. And so I'm working out kind of a new theory that I'm going to test drive on all of you. So I hope you'll play along with me tonight with this. So let's see if I can advance here. There we go. That works. So a little bit of a teaching anecdote. Like I said in my introduction, I teach architecture, and I teach with a colleague who's a landscape architect. And whenever students are presenting their projects to my colleague, they always make sure, because they're architects and he's a landscape architect, that they make sure that they ingratiate himself by talking about the green space that they're going to provide. And there'll be some green toned squares or a blob or a wiggly shape. And there'll be, so this is the green space in my project. And every time someone says that, I can just see him cringe, because he says green space just doesn't exist. It's a concept, but it's not a real thing. And in fact, if you Google green space and you try to get something specific, you always end up getting something real, because green space is a good intention, but it's actually too general to be helpful at all. So we're in need of specificity. There we go. In a conversation about green space, it has to be clear whether we're talking about something like this. Are you talking about a wetland? Are you talking about a park with a picnic table? Are we talking about playing fields or traffic islands? And so in any conversation between a client, a citizen, stakeholders, and the planners, designers, or policymakers on the other side, when that conversation is still hovering around the term green space, and one group is thinking of playing fields and another group is thinking of wetlands, or someone else is thinking of traffic islands, then you are really in a dangerous territory of not entirely understanding what you're going to get. And each of these is perfectly valid versions of green space and perfectly appropriate in certain places, but they're not interchangeable. And so this question about green space also applies when we're talking about public space. And so in a sense, green space is the concept, and we can all sort of nod in agreement when we're talking about how important green space is, as my colleague will acknowledge. But we really want to get to something called a percept, which is the actual thing. And in this case, Google gave me back an image of a lawn when I tried to get green space. And so this difference between a concept and a percept, another good example of that is when you read about the difference of these two words and we think about the concept of an apple. Each of us is thinking of an apple when I say that word, but it makes a world of difference if one of us is thinking of a Granny Smith and the other one's got a Honeycrisp in mind, and they have very different properties and we would use them in very different ways. And so this applies to public space. We'll shift out of my green space analogy with my colleague and we'll start talking about public space. But what I want to do this evening, since I'm the kickoff speaker, is I want to provide a little bit of an introduction of how to talk about public space. And I also want to unpack a little bit about the title of this program, Reclaiming the Commons. And what I'm going to do after that is, again, I hope you'll join me in being on board with a kind of metaphorical framework to talk about public space. So to unpack this term, the commons, so our concept is the commons, but we tend to know this phrase through a couple of things. One is it's often linked to this phrase, the tragedy of the commons. And this comes from a couple of writers who've explored this, first in 1833 and then in 1968. And I'm not necessarily going to go down that rabbit hole of explaining this, but it has to do with the dilemma of shared resources, particularly grazing land, and how our individual desires and wishes to prosper and to make use of a resource often come in conflict with the needs of a community or a collective. And so a commons, which is a really interesting term that we don't use that often anymore, is really a collective noun for a shared resource. And in the literature about tragedy of the commons, it has to do with a natural resource, again, grazing. And the complexity kind of comes in when we talk about what sharing actually means. In the original use of this term, from what I understand, a commons was truly shared. It wasn't privately owned or government owned. In the contemporary city, everything's owned or controlled by somebody. So we don't technically have literal commons, but we don't always read and experience the city that way anyway. We experience those shared spaces that we're occupying together, and we experience them with a sense of shared stewardship, if not ownership. So the parable of the tragedy of the commons, like I said, has to do with natural resources, grazing. But it gets interesting when we start thinking about what if we talk about these things from the perspective of a commons of social and cultural resources. And that brings us to our city and one of my favorite ways of representing it, which is a figure ground drawing. And so if we're talking about social and cultural resources, they don't have the same consumption problem that natural resources have. Instead, they have a different kind of problematic, which is these are the places where we work out our relationships as individuals to a community and to a sort of body politic, to a civic group. In that sense, those relationships, they literally take place, which is kind of an interesting phrase to think about. It's a very, offhand way of talking about something. We'll say an event takes place here, or this will take place later on. But when you think of that phrase, that an event takes place, it really ties activity to geography. It ties activity to place very deliberately. And so if we look at this image, this figure ground of Washington, you can sort of see all that white space, all the space in between buildings, all the space that kind of, we know where the river is, but we're really seeing everything that's not building. So in some sense, that's the space of the commons, everything that's between buildings. It's not clear in a drawing like this who controls anything, but we know by looking at it that that's the space that we inhabit together. And so all that white space here is undifferentiated. But when we really start looking at it, it's going to become much clearer and much more specific. So when we look at this and we start to say, oh, I can see the streets and the alleys and the circles and the squares, and you can recognize the mall, it's an extremely imageable city. And so when I was working on this talk, I was thinking, well, if we're going to talk about reclaiming the commons and the value of public space, I've got to be able to talk about all kinds of public space. And so you start to make a list. And even just looking at a drawing like this, that list becomes overwhelming. It becomes not useful enough because a list just doesn't imply the relations that we're looking for. And so I was thinking, well, what are other ways of organizing information like this? Biology gives us species and genesis, and botany gives us ways of describing plant communities and kingdoms. But none of those are really visual enough for me as an architect. And so I borrowed something else from science, and here's where you're going to play along with me, I hope, which is the periodic table of elements. So fair warning, I'm not a scientist, not pretending to be one, but like all my colleagues in architecture, I am a prolific and liberal borrower, shall we say, of ideas and strategies from other disciplines. And so if it's useful up to a point, and again, every metaphor will reach its breaking point, but I'm going to finish this talk long before we get there, hopefully. And so this one sort of sparked an interest in me in trying to figure out if we could organize public space the way the periodic table of elements is organized. And in the same way that the elements are illustrated here, they're grouped by certain similarities, their properties, their weight, their behavior, and also the ways in which they can easily combine with each other, or with great effort they can combine with each other. Some of them are long-lived, some of them are short-lived, and we're continuing to find new ones. And we use these elements to make larger molecules and larger, more complex things. So the more I thought about it, it seemed like a pretty useful way to organize what I am now calling the periodic table of public space. And it's not quite as random as it seems. If we think about all of the natural elements that are in the periodic table, those are actual foundational to actually the physical world we inhabit. And it's really the transformation of natural elements into cultural elements, which is the work of city building and the work of planning and design and material culture in general. So that shift from the raw elements into things that are cultural artifacts and social artifacts through our own imagination and labor is where we get the periodic table of public space. So this is going to allow us, instead of just talking about public space as a concept or green space as a concept, to be a little bit more specific and to try to get at the full spectrum of public spaces. What I'm going to show you will not be comprehensive, but again, I'll encourage you to play along at home. And you can start to add your own elements, because just like the periodic table, we're still discovering new ones. And so the general groupings here, the urban greens, the commemoratives, the civics, the corridors, and the strange one at the bottom, the unstables. I'm going to go through sort of a general description of what I'm meaning by each one of them, and then tell you at the end why on earth this is important and where does this lead us with the rest of the conversation this evening. So let's look at what happens when we start to populate these grand blocks and start to sort of name some of these. So I totally made this up. So again, metaphors reach their breaking point. But some of the urban space elements are actual foundational. And so they're going to be where oxygen and carbon and hydrogen are. And then some of them, for example, monuments and memorials, are where gold and platinum are. So the plazas, the street, those things are foundational in oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and some of the other valuable ones, gold and platinum. So in my discussion tonight, I'm going to kind of leave the deep greens and the infrastructure off the discussion, except for we're going to touch on infrastructure a little bit later. And that's because those aren't really, they're not fundamentally about human occupation, which is what we're talking about tonight. But again, that's arguable. So anyone who wants to play along at home, you can start to fill this in on your own. But I want to take them a block at a time and to sort of talk about a little bit more of what this gives us in terms of a vocabulary. And then, like I said, I'll finish up talking about some molecules that we're making and some that are combining elements that we might have thought were incompatible, but we have new ways of doing that. And so if we begin, let's begin with the urban greens, which is sort of where I started with the generic term of green space. And we can start to look at, and I have my own little abbreviations, which I almost forget as soon as I put them down, but we have productive green spaces like agricultural fields and orchards and community gardens and forests. And we have recreational green spaces like sports fields and lawns and walkways by the shore and even ornamental gardens, which is recreational in a different way. And we have ecological green spaces. We have easements and meadows and wetlands and all of those things combined. And so this begins to give you a sense of this is not comprehensive. There's blocks still to be filled in, but this is our urban greens. Moving on to the civics, we have the classics of plazas and squares, piazzas, the agora, the marketplace, the street. The street shows up in two, so I'm not really sure where it belongs, but I have it in the civic space and I also have it in the corridors. And I also included public libraries in the civics because we don't have to limit ourselves to outdoor space. Public spaces are found inside buildings as well, and the public library is sort of the classic, I think, civic building space. And then if we move into the corridors, you know, what is a corridor? So coming up with a term that helps us group them in an umbrella, a corridor connects and divides both. So it connects linearly, but by connecting 2 points, it also divides one side from the other. And so then there's the demand for reconnecting those two sides as in any given street. So we have streets, staircases, alleys, bike lanes, promenades, boulevards, avenues, rivers, canals, transit, and Woonurfs. I have a Woonurf down at the bottom there, which is a kind of corridor that we think is a brand new form of street space, of corridor, but it's actually, I think, one of the most ancient ones and maybe foundational to the idea of a street, the idea of a shared space where everybody has the right to that space. And then moving along, the commemoratives. And I'd say one of the things that gives our own city its absolutely unique character is the prominence of these precious elements, the commemoratives in the core of our city. And so these are expansive also and include all kinds of commemorative works, landscapes, memorials, monuments, cemeteries, civic art, and also museums, which again, like public libraries, have a certain function, not necessarily outdoors, but they're part of this same group. And again, you can add to these on your own. Then we get to the really interesting part, the unstables. And I'm calling them this because they come into existence like some weird elements. If you read popular science, you'll read about those weird elements that come into existence and then vanish. And so they have a short life. So all the elements have their own lives. And so the unstables, in a sense, depend on being hosted by another urban element. And so when we have protests, marches, sit-ins, Occupy, chalk speech on a plaza outside of a metro stop, temporary pop-ups, temporary tactical urbanism, these things, festivals, and down there at the lower right, you'll see streeteries, which were a newly born version of an unstable. And they're right in that mode of, are they going to become permanent? Are we going to have a way of making that permanent? Right now, we're still basically occupying asphalt and street space, but it's sort of a molecule in the making, which is an interesting way to think about it. And so the unstables kind of depend on other elements, and they come into existence and then they vanish. But we always have to have the capacity to allow them to come into existence. And then we get to the new molecules that we're making. And it's no accident I put the 11th Street Bridge Park rendering image up there. We're going to hear about that later. And I sort of wondered when I was thinking up this periodic table metaphor, if it was that particular project that prompted my thinking about how we combine sets of elements that may not typically go together to form a really interesting molecule that's something we haven't actually seen before. We saw that with the High Line, where you combined infrastructure with meadow, basically a colonized, planted, naturally green space, I use that term, that then gave us something entirely new that no one had seen. And so this idea that our imagination can take this set of elements and continue to make new things are the new molecules that, hopefully we'll be talking about tonight. So in that category include something that maybe is subtle, but also as meaningful as the renovation of Franklin Park, some of the new parks down by the waterfront. I would think the Reach qualifies as a new waterfront, as a new molecule. And I'm really intrigued by the question about Black Lives Matter Plaza, which began as an unstable, really fascinating act of civic taking place. But it's gradually turned into something else as it's become more permanent. And I think it's an interesting conversation about what kind of thing it is and whether in making it permanent, some of its qualities actually changed. And just like the elements in the periodic table, we don't often encounter them in their pure form. It's really hard to deal with them in their pure form. And so in a sense, almost everything I'm showing you is somewhat alloyed by other elements. But we do have a set of them where that's, I think, particularly notable, which is what we're looking at here. So why does all this matter? Aside from the fact that I think it's kind of a clever way of thinking about urban space, which is probably going to preoccupy me long after this program's over. Well, it matters because, as with the elements, we need all of them to make a live city. Just like we need all of the elements to make a living world, we need all of the urban space elements to make a live city. We don't need all of them all the time, everywhere, but we do need all of them. And when we do gather in conversation to talk about how to make the city better, how to make the city more equitable, how to make the city more inclusive, how to include a wider range of behaviors and events and activities, when it's designers, planners, public policy makers, funders, everyone who's involved in the shaping the space, and the citizens, users, clients, stakeholders, trying to get together to form a shared vision of what that should be, it's very important that we understand what we're really talking about. Because those conversations, as we name things, concepts and percepts, and as we show images of things, it's really important that that conversation, we gradually narrow the distance between the intentions of what one party is saying and the interpretations of what the other party hears. And as we can keep narrowing that gap of communication, the closer we'll get to a sort of shared vision of what the value of public space is. So thank you. I will stop my sharing and turn it over to the next speaker.
Well, thank you, Susan. Our next speaker, Scott Kratz, you want to come up here? He's going to talk about, is it a corridor? Is it a new molecule? What is it here? But anyway, Scott is a senior vice president of the Ward 8-based nonprofit Building Bridges Across the River and director of the 11th Street Bridge Park. Scott has been working over the last decade with communities on both sides of the Anacostia River and the D.C. government to transform the old 11th Street Bridge, which connects Capitol Hill with neighborhoods east of the river, into a park. A project that began with the goals of repurposing defunct infrastructure and joining communities effectively separated by a freeway bridge, has evolved into a project of incredible scope and complexity. Building Bridges embraces strategies to prevent displacement and increase home ownership in the neighborhoods that are adjacent to the new park and implement job training and employment for residents. Please welcome Scott.
It's always dangerous to go after Susan, but love that concept of the Bridge Park as this new fused molecule, because I think something you're going to be hearing tonight is the sort of how this park has become so much more than a park. So thank you, first of all, to the committee, and happy birthday, happy 100th. What I'm going to do tonight is share a little bit about the backstory of the park, but a deeper dive into how we engage local residents here in the District of Columbia to shape this new civic space. I'll walk you through some of our latest renderings. And then at the last third of the program, I'll talk about how our work to not only invest in the bricks and mortar of this new park, but also invest in the nearby residents, neighbors, and communities to ensure that those same residents who've shaped the park from the beginning can be the ones that benefit from it. So to start, whoops, I went the wrong way. As I clicked to the right, it went to the end instead of the other way around. So we don't have to rewind this presentation. We're going to start from the beginning. So a little context setting. So I work for Building Bridges Across the River. We are a nonprofit that's based east of the river, off Mississippi Avenue. We have our larger mission, our larger theory of change is to reduce structural and economic barriers to build a more equitable city here in the nation's capital. And we do this in several different ways. We run the ARC off Mississippi Mississippi Avenue Southeast, that has 14 nonprofits that are all co-located in one facility, a 203,000 square foot facility. We have 4 schools that are on site, National Children's Medical Center, Levine School of Music, the largest theater east of the river. And the larger idea is to, by leveraging our individual assets, we can make a much bigger impact in the community. We also run the Skyland Workforce Center that I'll be talking about a little bit at the end of the presentation. We run a network of 7 urban farms, all in Southeast DC, for a neighborhood that has one grocery store, serving only one grocery store serving 75,000 residents. But the largest project that we have to date is the 11th Street Bridge Park, and it's been my honor to lead that effort for the last decade. Here we go. So, keeps zipping to the end for some reason. No why. So as we're waiting for those slides to come up, and we ran through these before, but you can go to the end, to the beginning. There we go. Okay. Perfect. So our 3 sort of key goals for building bridges across the river, the ways that we implement those strategies. But we're here tonight to talk about the 11th Street Bridge Park. So this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really stitch together the city again. The city, the nation's capital, has been divided for generations by the Anacostia River, divided by race, by income, by health outcomes. and this idea to transform an old, aged out piece of infrastructure and create this physical and metaphorical bridge between these two communities, I think is the goal that most viscerally connects to local residents as part of the project. So I think everybody knows where the 11th Street bridges are, connecting the communities of Anacostia and Fairlawn east of the river to Capitol Hill, the booming area of the Navy Yard to the north or west of the river. And in our case, we had these old bridges that were built in the 1960s, between 1962 and 1967. This has been a point of crossing for over 300 years, but these bridges reached the end of their lifespan and needed to be replaced. So instead of getting rid of obliterating all of the old infrastructure, we had this once in a lifetime opportunity to save some of the old infrastructure, extend the life of that initial federal investment, and transform it into something very different. So the deck would have been cost prohibitive to keep, so the deck has been removed. Next slide. There we go. So the deck has been removed and we were able to keep the old piers and pilings that turns out is the most expensive part about building any river bridge. And I've learned more about engineering than I ever thought I'd want to know working on this project. But we're going to build a new deck that's on top, but one that no longer holds cars or tractor trailers, but that holds community generated programming spaces. So our 4 key goals that have been our goals from the beginning, these have been the 4 table legs that have held up the entire project, is re-engaging residents with the Anacostia River. The river is this amazing natural resource that has been hiding in plain sight for too long. The river's making a comeback and being restored, but to get people to really care about the river, we need to bring them down to it. Re-engaging or supporting public health for the residents along the Anacostia River that have some of the most challenging health statistics in the city and the country, actually. And we know that having an access to safe place to play can be a significant intervention to that. As I mentioned, that goal of physically and metaphorically bridging long divided communities. And then finally, how do we ensure that this park is not only an anchor for economic development, but equitable and inclusive growth? So, next slide, please. So before we engaged a single architect or even any engineer on this project, we spent over 2 years meeting with the community of saying, what do you think? What do you think about this idea of transforming an old freeway into a park? Good idea, bad idea? And we met with faith leaders and the elected leaders and business owners and civic associations. And this was really important, I think, particularly for the east of the river residents, where there's an enormous and justifiable trust deficit, right? People who probably look just like me have come into the communities east of the river and had a lot of ideas and made a lot of promises. And for a variety of reasons, those promises have not been fulfilled, right? So building that trust and making sure this was being driven by the local residents was key. And when when residents in these 200 meetings said, okay, well, this seems like an interesting idea. Let's see where this goes. We said, all right, well, then tell us what should be on the park. Tell us make sure that every single programming element was driven and came from the local community. So these were the ideas that we kept hearing pop up. We held 2 giant design charrettes on either side of the river. And then we launched a larger nationwide design competition, taking these ideas and asking designers to manifest them into a civic space. Much of our work has become, how do we put decision-making power back into the hands of local residents? So during the design competition, we actually created a group of about 36 local stakeholders who participated in the design competition. They met with our 4 final design teams again and again throughout the design process. And at the end of this 8 months, the community selected the design team. So I didn't get to vote. The community voted. And the selection was unanimous for the design by the architecture firm of OMA and the landscape firm of Olin. And you can see it's in essence a double-decked bridge that connects using the old piers and makes way for all of these community-generated programming spaces. And I'm going to take you for a little virtual walk from one side of the bridge to the other. Starting on the Navy Yard side, we're capturing every drop of stormwater into giant cisterns on either side of the bridge that we'll reuse for irrigation for the park. The trusses get you up high enough so you can see over the Navy Yard buildings, and you can see to the Washington Monument, you can see to the Capitol building. So imagine in July 4th, 2026, when we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of this great country, celebrating and watching the fireworks from the Bridge Park. On the east of the river, the trusses get you up high enough to see over the freeways and see the historic home of Frederick Douglass on Cedar Hill. A center gathering place that we call the Anaquash Plaza, honoring the Native American inhabitants, the Nacotchtank, who existed here for thousands of years. This will be a place not only of informal gathering, but also events, farmers markets, and the like. A hammock grove, a place not only of physical well-being, but mental relaxation. We just last year selected an amazing 3-women artist team who are going to be designing the hammock groves, inspired by local community leaders at each one. Next slide. I'm just going to say next because I don't think this is working. A community meeting space and cafe. Next. A area just outside the cafe that we call our community front porch, another medium-sized programming space. Next. One of my favorite areas for the park, an 11,000 square foot play space, another community requested item that we call Mussel Beach, not mussel, but M-U-S-S-E-L, named after the native bivalves that are helping to restore the river health. Our friends at the Anacostia Watershed Society have installed over 30,000 mussels in the river. I don't know who counted, but I'm taking their word for it. They're helping to reoxygenate the river. So there's lots of interactive and multi-generational activities there. Next. Anchoring the east side of the river will be an environmental education center that will be run by the Anacostia Watershed Society, touring DCPS and DC Charter School kids, inspiring the next generation of river stewards, access to the river from the east side through kayak and canoe launches. Next. Urban agriculture, that is one of our 8 urban farms. Next. And all told, this will be about 7.5 acres. When you include the land on either side, this is about the size of 3 football fields stacked end to end to end. Next. So we are now, after a dozen years working on this at 100% design, working with the community at every step. Our partners at the District Department of Transportation, the plan to solicit a general contractor late this summer, early fall, and we're on track to break ground at the end of this year and open up in the first half of 2026. But we didn't want to work quietly in our offices in these last 10 years. We wanted to be out there testing and piloting some of these programs. So we've now established 7 what we call our Bridge Park plots, these urban farms, east and southeast DC, as a way to build the capacity and start providing real-time access to some of this food. Our largest farm is at the Arc. Next. We harvest all of this food for a CSA and farmers market that kicks off next week from this Saturday. Join us at the Arc. And I've become totally fascinated with mushrooms during the pandemic. We harvested about 100 pounds of shiitake mushrooms that we distribute to the community. And then just last Saturday, we hosted our 9th annual Anacostia River Festival. This is an opportunity for a single afternoon to test and pilot what will happen 365 days of the year when the park opens. Next. But when we're out there talking to the community, asking what kind of programming should be on the park, and we incorporated all those programming ideas, we heard a much deeper need. We heard a need for housing, for jobs, for preservation of businesses, for celebrating and really amplifying the voices of local residents. And so we thought this was an opportunity not only to engage the community and create this space, but think about this in a very different way. How do we think early, intentionally, and most importantly with the community at the center to ensure those thousands, tens of thousands of residents who've been shaping this project from the beginning can be the ones that benefit from it? So we started looking at the 1 mile radius around the park, and that's the image that you see in front of you, looking at data like housing prices, the average household income, the poverty rates, and a couple items to pull out. There's a $390,000 delta between homes on one side of the river and the other, right? Depending on what side of the river you're on, separated by 900 feet of water. Here in the District of Columbia, there is an 81 times difference between the average household wealth of Black families and white families. 81 times, right? So clear disparities that exist here in the nation's capital. Next. And even if you look at life expectancy, here in the nation's capital, there's nearly a 15-year life expectancy, depending on where you were born and where you live, right? That should not, your zip code should not determine your life expectancy. So we thought of how do we engage the community, which we've done from the beginning, and can we create a series of strategies that well in advance of the park opening, we could start investing and provide these wealth building opportunities so that these local residents can really stay and thrive in place. And next, we did this for a year in 2015. In December 2015, we launched our first version of what we called our Equitable Development Plan. It's kind of a mouthful. And I'm not going to go through all 34 strategies with you, but I'm going to give you just a taste of what some of those are. In our housing strategies, we have been running for the last 6 years a Ward 8 Homebuyers Club. Now, this is for a community that has 75% of the community are renters at greatest risk of displacement. And we've seen 122 Ward 8 renters become homeowners who've gone through our Ward 8 Homebuyers Club, right? Capturing this generational wealth. We've stood up the Douglas Community Land Trust that now has over 220 units of affordable housing that you're going to hear about more from the next speaker. And we've been leading a series of tenant rights workshops from the beginning. Next. We just graduated our 28th construction training program, because if we're spending all this money to build the park, we want to make sure as much of those dollars go back into the local community. But to do that, we need to make sure that the local residents have the skill set and capacity to apply for and succeed at these jobs. So we've now seen 150 east of the river residents be employed in construction jobs. So when the general contractor comes to us, or if they do later this year, and says, well, I can't find any local residents to hire, we can say, well, here's a list of 150 people who are currently employed. Try again, try a little harder. Next. And we've invested several $1 million in businesses on either side of the river with a real focus on Black-owned businesses east of the river. We're just wrapping up a program with the big consulting firm Booz Allen, who's providing pro bono technical assistance to 10 Black-owned businesses along Good Hope Road. It's one of the main commercial corridors in Anacostia, working on creating marketing strategies, back of house financial services, and each of those businesses is receiving $8,000 in cash that we've been able to raise to help implement those strategies. It's been so successful. We're beginning phase 2 this summer with another 10 businesses. We're turning the corner and marching down Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue. Next. And we could get all those other strategies right, but if we lose what makes the neighborhoods unique on either side of the river, we've lost something very important. Those are huge downstream consequences. So we've installed several $1,000s in local, working with local artists, several hundreds of thousands of dollars, really amplifying the voices of local residents. And at this last Saturday, the Anacostia River Festival, we had several go-go bands. We kicked off the whole event with U.S. Navy Band. We had spoken word contests. It's really phenomenal. Next. And a great example of that is we've just announced last year commissions for public art for the park that the community selected. This is our largest piece of art by a mother-daughter duo from Jackson Jarvis Studios that they call Anacostia Sunrise Sunset Portals. It's one of the first things you'll see as you come into the Bridge Park site from historic Anacostia. Next. And finally, during the pandemic, we were concerned that the east of the river communities were going to be disproportionately impacted by COVID. And unfortunately, that came to pass. Highest rates of mortality east of the river. And so we banded together with three other amazing place-based nonprofits, Bread for the City, Far Southeast Family Strengthening Collaborative, and Martha's Table, to launch what became the largest unconditional cash transfer program or universal basic income program that's ever been attempted in the United States. $5,500 in cash to over 650 families, weekly groceries, monthly dry goods, wraparound navigator services to each of these families. And that's become a real model for this across the country. And what does an unconditional cash transfer program have to do with building a bridge, right? Kind of nothing but everything, right? It's being responsive, it's having deep listening to the community and seeing where we can meet those needs that are there. Next. We're now in the process of creating our third version of the Equitable Development Plan and adding in health and wellness strategies. I invite you all to come to the Arc the evening of June 13th, where we're going to be sharing some of these strategies. We asked for your thoughts and opinions, and we're going to be launching the final third version later this summer, early fall. And the last slide, I think. And so to date, we've been able to invest $86 million in these equitable development strategies. Now, this is more or in addition to the money that it's going to cost to build the park. So nearly the same amount of money as it's going to cost to build the bridge has already been invested in the community, all of which has been evaluated by a senior team from the Urban Institute, right? By the time the park opens, we'll have been investing in these equitable development strategies for a decade. That's really sort of unheard of. And we're very honored that we're now advising nearly a dozen similar projects around the country about how do you invest early and intentionally and with the community to make sure that you're getting ahead of issues of displacement gentrification. We've been advising projects in Minneapolis and Dallas and Buffalo and Grand Rapids and around the country because we're the nation's capital, right? This is the place where we should get this right, and we shouldn't all be making the same mistakes at the same time across the country. And I think that's it. So I look forward to the conversation and look forward to our next speaker.
Truly an amazing effort. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, our final speaker before discussion and questions is Coy McKinney, a staunch advocate for public space, a resident of Southwest DC since 2010. Coy currently coordinates the public sector section of the Southwest Community Garden in Landsberg Park, organizes for social justice with fellow neighbors in Southwest Action, and serves on the board of directors of the Douglas Community Land Trust. He is currently engaged with a community group in advocating to make permanent public uses that arose organically at a fallow, privately owned site at 4th and M Streets Southwest, which in another real estate lifetime was public property called the Waterside Mall. Please welcome Coy.
All right, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you about an issue that's really close to my heart. And if you're wondering from that bio, why is an urban agriculture teacher becoming an advocate for public space? Well, I hope to explain why these two parcels at 4th and M in Southwest have become so important to me and the rest of the Southwest community. Okay, so I was a history major, and so I like to provide historical context. And when you're talking about Southwest, you got to talk about urban renewal. It's the first site of urban renewal in the U.S. It was in the 1950s. 99% of the buildings were bulldozed. Over 4,500 Black family members were removed from the area. It was a multi-generational, multi-ethnic, diverse place beforehand. And then in the rebuilding of Southwest, only 5% of the housing dwellings were considered to be affordable. So that's the backdrop of Southwest. And in its reconstruction in 1970, the Waterside Mall was built. The Waterside Mall was eventually raised in 2007. Yep. To create more commercial and housing space along that corridor. The developers that purchased the lot or the lots, they sat on the land for over a decade. And so while that land was sitting vacant and unused, our local ANC said, hey, why don't you activate that land? And that's when the farmers market, the night festivals, the night markets, all that space, all those community engaging activities started. So also, while the developers were sitting on that land, Southwest got a lot of attention from development. It exploded in development, and Southwest is part of the planning area that's created the most amount of housing units. Unfortunately, it's also the planning area that has the second least amount of affordable units. So as you could probably predict, we've had a lot of gentrification and displacement. So from 2000 to 2020, the white population has increased 157%, while the black population has decreased 20%. This goes completely contrast to what residents expressed what they wanted in the Southwest Neighborhood Plan. In the Southwest Neighborhood Plan, trying to prevent a repeat of urban renewal, they said they want Southwest to be an exemplary model of equity and inclusion. Exemplary, as in an example to others, and we did not get that. They also said that 4th and M should be a central space for a thriving town center. And so the plan that they had to create this town center, well, I'll get to that in a second, was to build 2 apartment buildings that would have 598 units, and only 8% of those units would be quote unquote affordable. We'll get to that part in a second, but while the land was sitting vacant and the ANC, our local ANC said activate it, that's when we started to get the farmers market, which is now, it used to be just through the spring and summer. It's now all year long. So every Saturday, local vendors set up shop in this lot and they sell local produce. There's also an opportunity for people with low incomes to get fresh produce. There's a lot of different vendors there. I think it's probably got to be the best breakfast burritos in DC that I've gone there so many times that now they know my number and I can order ahead of time because they know that we're coming every Saturday morning to get those breakfast burritos. So there's a lot of different vendors that are at this spot, and it's also a spot for community composting. You can drop off your food scraps there. We have a Ward 6 mutual aid group that collects food from people who buy fresh produce from all the different vendors, and then they donate it to the Ward 6 mutual aid group, and then that group gives it out to residents in need. So we've also had the night markets, which occur every other Friday. I think it's the only open air night market in DC. There's music there. There's more than 45 vendors there. Most of the vendors are actually black and brown. I've spoken to some of the vendors, and some of them have been displaced from other areas like 8th Street and other areas where the rent has increased. And on a personal note, it's been one of the ways that I've gotten more rooted in the community. I've been able to have conversations with neighbors, meet new neighbors, hang out with other people that I probably wouldn't see otherwise in a manner where I don't have to spend $16 for a cocktail. It's literally right across the street from where I live. Enjoy some good music, support local businesses. It's been great actually, and that's partially why I don't see myself leaving Southwest. So when we talk about the power of public space and in activating public space, this is one of the reasons. This is an example of why that's so important. And so the visibility of it is also really key. When we've advocated for this space to stay, people said, well, you can move it to the Duck Pond, you can move it to Landsberg Park, you can move it to all these different parks, but it's not the same. So for example, the Duck Pond has been offered as a suggestion, but as you can guess, it has a pond in the middle of it. So that's not going to provide the same vibrancy as this space does. This is also what I refer to as downtown Southwest. It's right across from the Metro, the Safeway. It's at a big intersection. People walking to the wharf or just walking by are going to see what's going on there and be like, oh, what's going on there? And possibly support the vendors there. And so we've, in advocating for this space, several people who are relatively new to the neighborhood have mentioned to me, that was one of the selling points that got them to the neighborhood, was that they saw this market, they saw what was going on in this space, and that's what brought them there. This is like, oh, well, this isn't like other neighborhoods that have open space, because not all of it, but a lot of the space in DC is being developed mostly for unaffordable housing. So yes, so it's hosted not just farmers market and night markets, but it also had the 202 Creates Festival. There's a book festival that goes on there at least twice a year, I believe. The DC State Fair was there twice a year. So it's being actively used as a space for people to gather. And what I also really like is that there's movable chairs and shade there, so that, you know, if it's a nice Friday or a nice Thursday and you just want to hang out with friends, you can go there and not pay any, you know, fee or anything. You can just hang out there. So it's a great inviting community space. And so when I initially got involved with this in 2017, when I learned that they were going to try and build these 2 apartment buildings, and I was like, no, there's got to be, I have no background in affordable housing and advocacy and all that. So I have no background in that, but I was like, no, something's got to be done here. So the developer had sat on the land for over a decade, and the reason that we were able to get involved was because they were switching. It was initially zoned from commercial space to residential. And so then by that switch, that opened the planned unit development process, and so then they had to have public hearings, and that's when I got involved. So some of the issues are pretty obvious. It's more of the same expensive, non-family oriented housing that we've seen throughout Southwest. We'd be losing a communal space that I think is very important to the neighborhood. There was a recent allotment in the budget to build a space north of this site that would try to replicate this space. While that's great that they're trying to replicate this space, to me, it's still not going to be the same. So we're still more work to be done on this. But yes, so this is the initial thing that got me riled up. And so what we said is, we learned actually a little bit over a year ago that the site was for sale. So they went through this planned unit development process. It got approved by the zoning commission. Myself and a few other neighbors got involved in challenging it and took it to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals ruled against us, and so then the project was approved, and we were expecting development to happen. We learned a couple months later that then they were selling the lots. And so when we heard that, we were like, okay, this is our opportunity to try and reclaim this space and keep it permanent, democratize the space. And so we found that community land trusts are the model, or the economic or the housing development model, that we think is the best way forward. So community land trusts are nonprofit organizations that own land and then lease access to it at affordable prices. The Douglas COT, which I've become a board of directors, I've served on the board of directors for, is not a developer, but they help keep properties permanently affordable. Okay, and one of the ways that they do that is they restrict. This is when we're talking about housing. They restrict the value that people can sell their home at. So we're not thinking of housing as an investment. Then we're thinking of housing as housing, they will get, if you're building like a $300,000 house, you get your initial investment and you get some of the equity that's accrued over time, but you won't be able to sell it at full market price, which will keep the house affordable in perpetuity. And we've actually found there was a study that came out in 2018 that found that 75% of the people that participate in community land trust models are actually able to purchase for market rate houses because they've been able to save so much money through their housing costs. So community land trusts are, again, nonprofit organizations that own the land and then lease access to it, but they're also member driven. Okay, so this is where the democracy part comes in. The members of the community land trust can actually have a say in what goes on there. They have a direct say in the stewardship, in what type of amenities that they want there. And so community land trusts are not, they might be most well known for housing, but anything that can be built atop community land trust land. So you can have commercial space, you can have libraries, you can have schools, you can have all that stuff on top of community land trust land. But the key point is that the members have a say in that. And so usually the board of community land trusts follow a similar model where 1/3 of people that live on community land trust land, 1/3 are community members, and then 1/3 are industry professionals. So then that gives that the balance so that, you know, if people do not know one certain thing, then they can use the board of directors as a way of managing or getting out of tricky situations. So another model that we looked at is limited equity housing co-ops, which are great, but that's asking a lot of people who might not have any financial background to then manage their housing. With the community land trust, you have broad support, and that can kind of prevent those things from happening. And so we thought a community land trust would be the best way to determine the future of this site. With a lot of the development in Southwest, we haven't had a say. We go to the ANC, we'll go to a zoning commission meeting, we'll submit our testimony, and that's about the end of it. With the community land trust, we have a direct say in what goes on the site. And so even though the initial developers, they bought both of the parcels for $4 million, they're now assessed at $35 million. We know that that's asking a lot, but the DC government has spent tens of millions of dollars in the past for similar projects. And we think with the benefits that a community land trust provides, they should also invest in this. The most striking of these examples is the $50 million that was used to build 3 to 4 parks in Noma. If you're willing to spend $50 million for some parks in Noma, I think you could spend $35 million to provide a community land trust in the heart of Southwest. We also think that there's an argument to be made that since you've sat on this land for over a decade and you really only paid taxes on it, that maybe you can strike us a deal. And the developers that own the land, by the way, are Brookfield Properties, which is one of the largest real estate groups in North America. So I think that there's an argument to be made. And in fact, we recently, maybe less than a month ago, we had a meeting with the mayor about this issue. She didn't flat out reject the idea of purchasing the land. She was a little bullish on transferring it to the community land trust. But I think there's, another argument in a follow-up meeting. I hope we could convince her otherwise. But she didn't say that it's not possible. So we'll take that. We'll take that, and we'll continue to work with that. And so why do this? One, it's a passion. It's heartbreaking to see this stuff happen right in front, literally right in front of you. And so then that's one reason to get involved in something like this. But also the collective power and that feeling of being with like-minded people is also really important. So you can socially connect with neighbors in different ways. You can utilize different skills to get things accomplished, which has been great. I've met so many other neighbors I would have never met who have particular skills that are great at addressing or asking questions, coming up with presentations, coming up with ideas to promote this idea. So that's, I feel like, is important and powerful. You create a network. We've got over 1,100 signatures in support of this Fourth and M petition. And so that's 1,100 people that, you say, let's show up at a mayor's event. That's, that's power. That's powerful right there. And then, of course, there's the political part, which is where you can shift the paradigm. Like what Scott was presenting, we gotta try something new. We've been doing the same type of development for years and years, and it's not working. And so this is an opportunity to shift the paradigm in how we develop spaces. And I've actually been kind of surprised at the number of university students who have reached out to us asking for more information on what you're doing, why you're doing this, and learning from this type of organizing, hopefully to implement somewhere else. And then the last reason why you get into this is to win. And so we haven't done it yet, but I'm still hopeful that something other than 598 units that were 8% are affordable will get built there. And so, this is an important space. We're actually having a Friday night market this Friday. So if anyone is interested or available to see why this space is so important, you can come out to 425 M Street, right across the street from the Waterfront Metro. From 6 to 9 p.m., there'll be live music, lots of vendors, and you'll get to see why this effort has catalyzed so many people in Southwest. That's it for now, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Coy. We're going to have questions here. Aiden's going to moderate here. The microphone is right there.
Have we got a live mic? Okay. So we'll take questions from the audience, and if you have a question, you want to come to the microphone in the aisle. And we know that some of the people that are here have reasons for being here, and we could make speeches, and perhaps you have a few sentences you want to say, but if you can confine your speaking to questions and bring a question to the fore promptly, that would be very helpful, and we would appreciate it. So you can direct your questions to all of the three speakers, and Susan will be able to hear your questions. I think she can hear right now what's going on. Am I right, Susan?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay. So first question from the audience.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question about.
Stand a little closer.
I'd like to ask the question about, with your experience here, particularly in D.C., the comp plan, which was recently enacted, called for a little over 400 acres of additional public parkland. If you take the last time the DC Parks and Recreation Department had a master plan, and the population then versus the population that's projected in the new comp plan, which is almost 1 million people, you're going to come up with a need for 45,000 additional acres. How do you have any suggestions? Because our efforts so far have failed. How do we get to ensure that land use planning is incorporated in things like flood prevention on the west side of the Anacostia, as opposed to just coming up with building standards for flooding buildings? We lose the parkland there, et cetera. But do you have any suggestions how this feature could be received better than it has? Thank you.
I can jump in. Thank you for the question. I think first I'd comment on just agreeing on the value of green space. And we've seen this during the pandemic, right? I mean, the green spaces were where we could safely recreate, where we could get together, where we could hang out. I mean, 3 days a week I end up running along the Anacostia River Trail. And I've met friends. I've met the friends that I hang out with today. So the value of that green space, the value of what that does physically, psychically, mentally, spiritually, I think is really critical. Although this is only going to be 7 acres, so a little dent in that larger need. Certainly, what's been interesting is there's been we're now tracking about 170 of these transformed infrastructure into parks projects across North America. What started at the High Line, the now is happening in cities sort of across the United States, and it's a way to take that initial federal investment or local investment and really give it back to the people, right? Give it back to and create sort of new space that otherwise would have been utterly sort of eviscerated and collapsed. So it's not going to answer that whole question, but it's a start. Anything else, Dan?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it. I would say putting political pressure on people in position of power is one way. In the pandemic, I kind of turned into a Twitter troll. And every time a council member or the mayor would say something, I would ask, oh, what about this? When she got on Kojo, try and call in, ask a question there. So if you consistently put these questions to your council members and people in positions of decision-making power, then hopefully we can get some type of change. And also organizing. Organizing, I think, will always, well, not always, but it's a step in the right direction.
And I want to weigh in. I don't know how I appear in the room. Scott's looking up like I'm the voice of God. But I did want to weigh in because I think Scott's point is really important, that there are spaces, infrastructure and spaces that are hiding in plain sight, that if we expand what we mean by park space, and this gets to this idea of a more enriched vocabulary, then we might be able to discover ways to make more recreational space, more ecological, more productive space. And I think back to the pandemic when we, in the city, closed a lot of streets, and there's still some of those around. I walk past north of DuPont Circle, the one block on 20th Street. Nobody seems to be missing that in terms of traffic. Currently, we're thinking of those as streeteries, which is a really interesting idea, that you spill out from the restaurants and it allowed people to sort of dine. There's some really curious negatives to that. Right now, we've taken over public space and turned it into private space. And so those occupations of closed streets deserve to be questioned, and the reclaiming of some of our public space. But the act of closing a street lets us reimagine what that particular space can be. And it doesn't need to only be cafes where you buy the expensive cocktail, as Coy talked about. So there's public space in front of us if we can think of reimagining how it's used. And I think that's the interesting challenge, is we can't think of traditional park space necessarily. We have to think of what those different, I'll go back to my pitch, what those different molecules actually are that we can invent.
Thank you. My question was for you, Ms. Palladino, but you already answered it in part. I was going to ask if you could kind of apply your general principles to their very specific proposals here that they're both working on. So do you want to address either the Bridge Park or the great space that's been opening up on 4th and M?
Well, I'll just add that I'm a real cheerleader. I've been following the Bridge Park since it began, and I've known Scott since he started this. And it's fascinating how there's a saying, I think one of my students told me that, to invent a world, you first have to bake a loaf of bread, or it's something to that effect. And I think to invent a park, you have to invent a world. And I think what Coy is doing with the 4th and M, I go down there and I see that space, and I've been fascinated to see a gradual kind of occupation of it by people claiming that space. And I think using the term fallow is a really good use of the term. That's an agricultural word, and it means it's unproductive. And, the sort of activities that then grow up around those spaces, I would making a note of this, it's currently an unstable, like it's currently in that category, and it's being hosted by this space. And I think the idea of being clever and creative about how we reshape those spaces is a real challenge. And I'm going to be following what Coy is doing from now on, because I think that's a real space.
I had another question, but I see the line forming behind me, so maybe I'll get a second shot. I think you were next, and then
Hi, I came here when Kai was speaking. I know him. I live 1 block away from the site he talked about. So my question is, do we have any other lots in DC, in any neighborhood where residents are trying to save it? If yes, I'm kind of curious to know how the Committee of 100 will be able to provide some support. How the Committee of 100, how this organization can provide support to residents trying to save a space, a public space.
And was that how each of our organizations, how organizations can work to help save some of those spaces? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I would like to use this as an example because in Southwest, where residents are trying to save this space, or as you talked about CLT, organizations like you, what kind of support you could directly provide?
Yeah.
And also, are there any other neighborhoods in DC where residents are trying to save a public space, or save a piece of land, or use it for some other purpose where there is some kind of greater conflict that you are aware of?
Yeah. Well, I'm very. There's a direct outgrowth already because the Douglas Community Land Trust was a direct result of the Bridge Park's Equitable Development Plan. That was a key strategy that the community asked for. So we spent 3 or 4 years engaging the local residents, engaging council. We ended up raising $3 million for the early property acquisition for the Douglas Community Trust. Is this? That's so much better. Sending all of the advisory committee through leadership training that then ended up becoming the board. So in a way, we've already begun this work. But I think I'll go back to my fellow panelists' suggestion. That community engagement is absolutely key. I'll give you a great example. There are 2 large parcels of land right now, right along the Anacostia River, RFK Stadium, right, which is a massive piece of land, and Poplar Point, which is just across the river that stretches between the 11th Street Bridge and the Frederick Douglass Bridge. Poplar Point is a 110-acre parcel, right? 70 acres will remain as green space. 40 acres is slated right now, according to the congressional law that passed in 2006, will be a mixed-use space. Beyond that, it's not clear what that space should be, right? So that is an amazing opportunity, right? One of the last big parcels left in the District of Columbia for the community to really have a voice. And there's already been several local residents who've actually created a Poplar Point, the Public Space Committee, that are having monthly workshops well in advance of the city putting out an RFQ to make sure that the community's voices are heard. I think that becomes a really good model for some of these other spaces, whether it's RFK or even smaller spaces. So Brenda Richardson is leading that effort. And if you Google just Poplar's Point Public Space Committee, I'm sure it'll pop up. I think they've got their next meeting in early June with the National Park Service.
I've been asked to say to you all that are in line, we can take your questions, but because we're running out of time, we won't be able to take any more people than those that are in line right now with questions. So, and also make your questions as brief as you can, and I know the speakers will be as efficient as they can in answering. Thanks.
And we will both be here for the reception too, so if you don't get this, please see us afterwards.
Okay, I have a lot to say, and I'll make it as brief as possible. At the very first one of these series in the lectures that we've been having, had Mayor Bowser and Phil Mendelson, and a person asked Muriel Bowser about future parklands and what her vision was, and she said, and what the city would do, and she said, well, we don't have much space to add, it's hard to get new land, but we could make better use of what we have, and that there's so much of the land that's under the control of the federal government, and the Fort Circle Parks were she mentioned the Fort Circle Parks. Well, I happen to have been with the Committee 100, which started this, and that is I've helped form an organization called the Civil War Defenses of Washington, the Alliance to Preserve the Civil War Defenses of Washington, which the Fort Circle Parks are part of. There are historic parts of it, and then there are parkland areas that were added as part of a Macmillan Commission report that the Committee 100 is very familiar with. I truly, and I am a co-founder of this organization, and I believe very strongly that these areas could be so much better used, that especially the areas that aren't, very historic and have to be protected. They should be preserved. But there are a lot of land around it that would be very useful. The problem we've had is getting the Park Service really to focus on them. Until our organization was formed, there was no one assigned to be ahead of it. There's no superintendent. We did finally get a program manager. We now have 3 people assigned from the Park Service to cover. In D.C., there are 16 of these. There's 2 more, one in Maryland and one in Virginia. 16 areas, and they're all over. It's a circle of parks. They're beautiful. They're on highlands. They're beautiful to look at. They're beautiful to look from. They would make better parkland. Some people have said they should be turned over to the city. I don't necessarily subscribe to that, I think, but I do agree with the concept that maybe the city would be more responsive to the public than the Park Service is, and the Park Service has not been 100% responsive. So I would be interested in your thoughts about, how we could better, and I need help on this. We have an organization, but we're all volunteers and we're not rich, but we're hardworking, and we sponsored the Fort Circle, the Fort Stevens annual commemoration every July of the Battle of Fort Stevens, and please come out on July 15th there. It's a lot of fun. It's a recreation too.
Yeah, I'll say just briefly, I'm a huge fan of the Fort Circle Parks as well. I hike with my dog all the time in Fort DuPont. I've worked with friends and neighbors to help grow food at the community garden that's also in Fort DuPont. The nature trail that goes all the way up to Fort Reno is really amazing. I will say that the superintendent for National Park Service East, Superintendent Morrison, she really gets it. Now, she's under-resourced for sure, but she really understands the value of listening to the community, and in the tools that she has at her disposal, I found her extraordinarily reasonable. There's limitations to for sure, and NPS is not the fastest moving creature on the planet, but I have a lot of respect for her. So I'd just continue working out, and afterwards, happy to have a conversation during the reception.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you so much for this invitation. I really enjoyed all of your presentations. My name is Ernest Johnson. I am chairman of the Friends of the Frank Reeves Group, a nonprofit organization. I have attended the Southwest M Street rally. In fact, I used to be a resident. I used to own a townhouse down in that area. But I did attend a couple of your events, and I do appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate what the Committee of 100 is doing as well. One of the things that we have done as a native Washingtonian trying to preserve some of these spaces, we submitted a 125-page proposal to the city, a $100 billion renovation of the Frank Reeves Center in competition with some traditional developers. And they are always favored over our nonprofit organizations. The issues that we run into is the same thing that the Southwest Group is running into, is the financing. And, how do you get the $100 million? Now, I'm completing my degree at Harvard in business analytics and mathematics. So we're very capable in terms of putting these things together. But one of the things that you mentioned was the wealth gap in the city. The wealth gap continues to grow because most of the African Americans are participants in the program, and the whites are the managers and the runners of the program. In order not to just get construction jobs, we have the capability of managing and running programs as well. And if organizations like yours would work with us to ensure and to elevate that, then I think those are the things that will begin to close the wealth gap. So I think we have a great opportunity to work together here. We're working with the DuPont east of the Civic Action Association, DACA. We're also working with the Shore Citizens Alliance Association. So we're developing some coalitions that are pretty strong, and that's who informed us about this particular meeting. So I think if we could get together at some point, and we'll discuss it maybe after the meeting, about how we could build a stronger coalition that will put African Americans in a position of leadership. You know, I'm just not looking for construction jobs. I mean, even though a lot of people in our community need that, we have a lot of other talents and capabilities as well. And those things we think will help shrink the wealth gap in the city if we're afforded those opportunities. So we need organizations and individuals like all of you to work with us in order to elevate us to be able to participate in one. The Frank Reeves building is one of those buildings that are paramount to development on U Street. We had the support of Virginia Ali, Ben's Chili Bowl, Rick Lee, the Flower Shop. You know, it was Black Broadway for a number of years. And now that the gentrification has come in, it's anything but it's a very significant part of our history, of our culture, and it's very important that we maintain it. But if we're denied the financing to do that on that alone, then the wealth gap widens, the animosity grows, and we have problems in the city that we really don't need. And I know all of you now are seeing and hearing about the continued violence, the hijacking, and all of the education problems. And that comes from those economic issues that we're talking about. And those things have to be addressed. So thank you so much for the invitation. I look forward to speaking to all of you after this meeting. Thank you.
Jim Schulman here. I want to thank the Committee 100 because I'm super big fans of all three speakers here. So it's like a hat trick bringing all three of you together. You know, I worked with Susan years ago with the Architects, Designers, and Planners for Social Responsibility and helped a little bit with the Bridge Park with Scott and with Coy through the DC for reasonable development and the Grassroots Planning Coalition. So I'll give you a softball question here. I'd love to hear along the arc of your work in terms of this issue of reclaiming public space, some lessons learned. And so those could be lessons you've learned, you know, in your efforts to accomplish your goals. And it you know, it's not just in terms of development, it could also be in terms of teaching, Susan. So I'd love to hear lessons learned. Thank you.
That's a great question. I guess, I mean, it's cliche, but don't give up. So many times, I've been part of this since 2017. So many times people have said, oh, that's a waste of time. The city, they're going to develop it. But we kept on pushing, and eventually we get more and more people learn about it. You start to get momentum, and things change. So that would be, I guess, the thing for me.
Well, I'm building on that. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we were sort of tilting at windmills, and now we're going to be breaking the ground on the Bridge Park later this year, right? So just not giving up is key. I think the other two comments, and I mentioned several of this as my presentation, but just making sure that one continues to put the community at the center, right? I mean, two of the questions that animate a lot of our conversation internally within the Bridge Park team is, who is this for? And who's going to benefit, right? Those are two different but related questions. And what came from that is the equitable development plan. And I think that's the final lesson, is not to be afraid to open one's aperture, right? And think about, like, again, on the surface, like, what is workforce development or supporting Black-owned businesses east of the river or standing up the community land trust have to do with building a park? Like, everything, right? And by widening that aperture, it makes sure that we're starting to answer those two questions, like, who is this for and who's going to benefit? Susan?
Yeah, thanks. And Jim, great to hear from you. not entirely see you in person. I think lessons learned from teaching about public space is that it takes a lot of patient observation, and to get students, architects, urban design students, landscape architects, planning students, to really understand what makes a space successful. Again, back to Coy's discussion of 4th and M Street, we can have spaces that are accidentally successful for a set of reasons, and trying to understand why that's a great latent public space. And then we can design spaces and think that things are going to happen and program the heck out of them. And they don't always work. And so there's a lot of nuance and a lot of kind of patient understanding. And so I would just make a pitch to all of these questions that the district is really resource rich in universities and in public policy programs and planning and architecture and design. I think Coy mentioned that university students have been approaching him. And it's sort of a wonderful way to get attention paid to some of these questions from people who are developing into design and planning and public policy professionals who can sort of help to shape the city in the future.
Well, thank you. These speakers have just provided so many ideas for all of us, and we appreciate your coming and sharing not only, you know, what your goals are and what your successes have been, but how you went about pursuing that. And that's so important. It's something we all need to hear, and we thank you very much. And thank you for the audience for coming and listening to us and helping us celebrate 100 years.
Yes. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you, Susan, Scott, and Coy. There's going to be refreshments in the lobby, so please, in the narthex, please enjoy that and talk to any of us if you want. If you're not a committee of 100 members and you want to learn more about what we're all about. We hope to see. This is not the last of these conversations. There's 2 more coming up. The next one is in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from tonight, entitled "Before Development is Done: Empowering Residents with ArcGIS Visualization." And then there'll be another, the final conversation will be in September. I want to thank Andrea Rosen and Carol Ayton, who are the leaders of the team here that put this program together tonight. And hope you all hope this was all worthwhile for all of you. Thank you.